Imagine you're born in 1927 into a German family living in a town on the fringes of Germany. You're 5 years old when the Nazis take power, and you're just about to turn 12 when they invade Poland, which is right next door to the city you're living in, and they thus start World War II. And you're just 17 years old when you join the Waffen-SS, which is Hitler's elite paramilitary police force. You're 18 years old, wounded, you're taken prisoner by the Americans, you're released, and you start to write novels. You're going to be writing, or at least you're going to be thinking about the things that you did. You're going to be thinking about your comrades. What were they going through? What was it like for them? How do you deal with this aspect of your past? And that's what occupied Günter Grass in the novels that made him famous. You know by now, our Nobel Prize winners, our writers, they tend to be born into middle-class families. And this is no coincidence. German literature of the modern period is to a certain extent middle-class literature. Why does this matter? I think we've seen already that it brings with it a certain relationship to wealth, to power, and to the creative spirit. It was no different for Günter Grass. He was also born into a middle-class family. And in his case, it doesn't seem to be the contrast between the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of artistic impulses, which was important for him, but the question, how does writing articulate with power? And also, how does it articulate with your own life, with memories of your own life, and with the reconstruction of your own life? We're going to be talking about that today. Grass was born, as I said, 1927, and his parents owned a shop called a Kolonialwarengeschäft, which was quite a common term at that time. There's not really an English equivalent, but it means as much as a shop selling colonial goods, which started out meaning things like spices and coffee and stuff that came from the colonies. Germany had lost its colonies when Grass was born. It owned a few colonies, or operated a few colonies. I guess the best way to say it is it occupied a few colonies in Africa and the South Seas around the turn of the century. And in the 20s, when Grass was born, there was a movement afoot to try and regain colonies. I'm mentioning this just as an aside. It doesn't really figure in his work, but it does figure into the general historical memory of the German people. I've also been mentioning where our artists, our writers, were born. In some cases it doesn't matter that much, but in Grass's case it does. He was born in Danzig, in the free city of Danzig, which is now Gdansk in Poland, but at the time it had only recently been recognized as a free city. It was right adjacent to Poland, and over the centuries it had been bounced back and forth between Russia, Poland, Prussia, and Germany. In 1919, with the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, a Polish corridor, so-called, was formed, giving Poland access to the sea, and right next to it was the city of Danzig, made a free city and protected by British and Polish troops. Danzig was and had been for a long time essentially a German city. For every one Polish speaker in the city, there were 50 German speakers. And his childhood experiences of living in the city stayed with him his whole life long. And in a way, he was going to return again and again to what it felt like to be a citizen of a so-called free city, being moved back and forth, being a political football between large global powers. In a way, one way to read his writings is the voice of a politically concerned writer asking how an individual can voice their opinions, their ideas, their thoughts, their memories in between the political forces that want to shape you and nationalize you and form you into a national citizen. So Danzig in his writings comes to stand in as a place which is the playing field of global political forces. Take, for example, a novel that he wrote in 1977 called Der Butt, which was published as The Flounder. Der Butt, it's a fish. It might be a halibut. And it's a retelling of the old fairy tale of the fisher who goes to the sea, catches a talking fish, who grants him 3 wishes. He lets the fish go in exchange for the 3 wishes, and he goes home and talks to his wife about it, and they try to decide how they're going to use the 3 wishes. So the novel begins in prehistoric times when a fisherman catches this fish at the same spot where the city of Danzig is later going to emerge on the Baltic coast, and he talks to his wife about the wishes. This is what we read quite close to the beginning of the novel. I, down through the ages, have been I, and Ilsebil too has been from the beginning. I remember our first quarrel toward the end of the Neolithic, some 2,000 years before the incarnation of our Lord, when myths were beginning to distinguish between raw food and cooked food. And just as today, before sitting down to mutton, with string beans and pears, we quarrelled more and more cuttingly over her children and mine, so then, in the marshland of the Vistula estuary, we quarrelled to the best of our Neolithic vocabulary over my claim to at least 3 of her 9 kids, but I lost. And for all the Ur phonemes my nimble, hard-working tongue was able to line up, I did not succeed in forming the beautiful word father. Only mother was possible. In those days, Ilsebil's name was Awa. I too had a different name, but the idea of having been Awa doesn't appeal to Ilsebil. And it leads us through the history of this city, through the ages, right up to almost the present day. It ends in 1970 with an episode from the so-called Polish uprising in December 1970, where there were strikes and open marches in the street, broken up and quashed by the Polish People's Army and citizen militia. 44 people were killed and over 1,000 were wounded. So at the very end of this novel, we read the following. What is history? No one knows exactly when our common cabbage, Brassica oleracea, as important an innovation as buckwheat, millet, potatoes, rutabaga, was first planted on a large scale. For as far back as Mestwina's time, the Pomortians gathered the seeds of the early wild varieties. Undoubtedly, the Ems dispatch set a good deal in motion, but the sugar beet far more. If Prince Hamlet, as Ghost, had invited Swantopol and Fortinbras, the Kashubians and the Norwegians, to a meal of flatulent pork and cabbage, history would have taken an entirely different course. I said as much to Jan. But when, in the following year, shortly before Christmas, a rise in the price of staple foods was announced in Poland, when all along the Baltic coast the workers went on strike, there was plenty of pork and cabbage at the canteen of the Lenin shipyard. Yet history did not take a different course, but the usual bad one. They shot Jan in the belly. On December 18th, 1970, they shot Jan in his belly full of pork and cabbage. The police of the People's Republic of Poland shot, along with other workers, the naval construction engineer, employee of the publicity department, trade union, and Communist League member Jan Lutkowski, aged 43, in his belly, then full of pork and caraway cabbage that had been dished out to upward of 2,000 striking workers in the canteen of the Lenin shipyard. Just in time, just before the shipyard was cordoned off by the police, Maria Kochora, who was in charge of provisioning the shipyard canteen, had managed to divert to the shipyard a truckload of cabbage intended for the army. Deep frozen pork ribs were already on hand, and there's never been any shortage of caraway seed in Poland. He died instantly. By this time, Günter Grass had been living in Berlin, in West Berlin, the divided city, for quite a while, and the teenage member of Hitler's Waffen-SS had long since become a committed socialist of the kind that Hitler would have wanted to get rid of. So it's no surprise, really, that he was very interested in the ways that the East European countries, the socialist countries, the communist countries, the members of the so-called Eastern Bloc, the way they put socialism into practice, or the way they failed to put socialism into practice, such as when their citizens, the working class, would protest and revolt, demanding certain rights which they didn't get, and they were put down rather brutally by the police. For example, the Polish uprising of 1970, or the uprising of German workers in East Germany in 1953, which was also quashed in a very brutal manner, and which gave rise to a play that Grass wrote, which he called Die Plebejer proben den Aufstand. The plebeians rehearse the uprising. This was a play that he wrote in 1966. Grass had lived in West Germany ever since being released as a prisoner of war. He had worked as a stonemason's apprentice in Düsseldorf, and then he had attended the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, the Academy of the Arts, where he trained as a graphic artist and a sculptor. And in fact, Grass was quite an accomplished artist who provided the images for the covers of most of his books. In the 1950s, he held a couple of successful art exhibitions, and around this time he started writing fiction. In 1957, he joined a famous organization of West German writers called the Gruppe 47, the Group of 1947. That's when it had been founded. And it was intended as a forum for young writers who could try to work their way through the experiences that they had had of the past decades, and who could try and experiment with the possibilities of literature in expressing this particular moment in German history. Heinrich Böll, who we'll be talking about next time, he was a member of it, and so was Peter Handke, who received the Nobel Prize in 2019. In 1959, Nelly Sachs had just written Oh, the Chimneys. Günter Grass published his first novel. It was called Die Blechtrommel, the Tin Drum, and this novel was an immediate success. It was the first in what he called his Danzig trilogy, followed in 1961 by Katze und Maus, the novel that we are reading this week, and then in 1963 by Hundejahre, Dog Years. These three novels, the Danziger trilogy, they're set in Danzig in the years before World War II, during World War II, and in the time afterwards. In The Tin Drum, Oskar Mazerat, the protagonist of this novel, is sitting in a mental institution. He's arranged to have himself admitted, and he's telling the story of his life looking back. He was born in Danzig in 1924, 3 years before Grass was born, and he decides that when he's 3 years old, 1927, the year Grass was born, he's going to stop growing up. He's going to stay a 3-year-old for the rest of his life. He doesn't want to be an adult, and he certainly doesn't want to be a grocer, which is what his father wants him to be. Remember, Grass's own father was a grocer. And we read in this book Oskar telling the story of his various adventures in the time leading up to the Second World War, during the time of fascism, during the Second World War, and afterwards. And on his 3rd birthday, he was given a tin drum. And this drum accompanies him throughout his adventures. It has the function of announcing in loud and inarticulate tones a certain drama that enters the story. Oscar also has a special talent that he can let out a shriek which is capable of breaking glass and destroying things, and he uses this shriek creatively from time to time. Is this what writers do? Maybe it is. Maybe writers pound on tin drums and shriek to destroy things. Oscar appears to have two fathers. One is his mother's husband and the other his mother's lover. And he and we are never entirely sure who the true biological father is. But we see both of them being shot. In the death of his mother's husband, Oscar is kind of implicated. His father is attempting to hide the fact that he was a member of the Nazi Party. Russian troops have just taken Danzig, and his father is standing there holding a pin, a Nazi pin, which, if the Russians find it, will tell them that he was a Nazi himself. And Oscar is somehow partially responsible for his father then attempting to swallow this pin and falling into a fit and being shot by one of the soldiers. Now, this semi-betrayal, this semi-implication is important, and we're going to find it recurring in Cat and Mouse. Remember, there's a certain statement that's made, which I'll be coming back to in just a minute, a statement made by the narrator of Cat and Mouse. And it makes us wonder when we read about it, what is the position of the narrator who himself is at a distance, an outsider from the Nazi Party, and maybe wants to see members of the Nazi Party punished, maybe wants to see innocent people punished. Why? Maybe not for helping to fight the Nazis sufficiently. There are a lot of maybes here, and the maybes are important for Grass. It's as if Grass's narrators are saying, if you were a member of the Nazis, you should just admit it. You should be honest with yourself and with the public. But it's also as if he's asking, if you were a Nazi, how do you stop being a Nazi? How and when? And how can you be sure? And why did you do the things you did? This is clearly a question for him personally, and it's a question for the German people in the post-war years. So in the late 50s and early 60s, he was using the Danzig trilogy to think through his own past and his country's past. It wasn't until 2006 that he spoke publicly and openly about his own past. He wrote an autobiography which he gave the title Das Häuten der Zwiebel, translated into English as Peeling the Onion. And in it he admitted that he had been a member of the Waffen-SS. He admitted that he had been implicated as a Nazi, admittedly as a teenager, as a youngster, but still, that's what he had done. And he was asked in an interview why. Why did he wait so long before talking about it? And he was publicly criticized, quite sharply criticized in some instances, for having hidden his years as a Nazi, as a member of the Waffen-SS. And he said, it was a burden on me. My silence over all these years is one of the reasons I wrote the book. It had to come out in the end. It had to come out in the end. During the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Grass had become increasingly politically involved. He was a public intellectual and an avowed socialist who was closely aligned to the SPD, the Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschland, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the party which is now in power. And he was close friends with Willy Brandt. Brandt was federal chancellor between the years 1969 and 1974, the fourth chancellor of Germany after the war. And we find this strange polarity in his life. The public intellectual role which he had come to take on as the voice of morality, the voice of what was politically the correct path to follow, the voice of human rights and justice, that and the past, which had contained an episode which was quite the opposite of this. And like I said, a lot of people were quite unhappy that Grass had not spoken earlier about this. And I guess in judging his actions, we have to ask ourselves how we would act in that situation. Let's go back to 1961. Grass is living in Berlin, in West Berlin. In East Berlin, they are busy piling stone upon stone and building the Berlin Wall. And Grass is already a well-known writer because the tin drum has basically made him famous. And he is in the process of publishing the second in the Danziger trilogy, the novel which we are reading, Cat and Mouse. Cat and Mouse is the story of a relationship. The focus is on this fascinating character, Malke. Malke, you will have noticed, is an outsider, but he's an outsider with a quite ambivalent relationship to his own social standing, to his own social position. On the one hand, he really seems to pursue this outsider role, and on the other hand, he tries to cover it up. Like he tries to cover up his very prominent Adam's apple. And it's the Adam's apple that forms the central image of the book. So Grass is focusing on an outsider figure, and it makes us think about his own position as an outsider. Maybe that's what writers are, outsiders. But Grass certainly doesn't feel comfortable in the roles that he has played in society, and perhaps even in the role that he's playing in society now. And we see this in the figure of Malke. Malke with his ambivalent relationship to being an outsider in Nazi Germany. Malke who steals the Knight's Cross from one of the celebrated soldiers who speaks at his school, Malke who later earns his own Knight's Cross, and Malke who deserts the German army and wants to flee to Sweden. And maybe he does flee to Sweden, we don't know. But when we look at his Adam's apple, what is this Adam's apple? Why is it so important for Grass? It's a strange figure to put at the center of a novel. The Adam's apple, the figure of original sin which is visible on the body of this person, and opposite the cat that attacks it. What is that cat? Some people have said that the Adam's apple, the original sin, is Nazism, and the cat is West German society trying to come to terms with Nazism. Is that the right interpretation? I'll leave that for you to decide. I said this book was about a relationship. The other character in the relationship is the narrator himself, Pielens. And he's a complex character because we find him trying to uncover a story, but at the same time trying to obfuscate. And this leads to the characteristic style of the writing. Take a look at this passage very early on. And now it is up to me, who called your mouse to the attention of this cat and all cats, to write. Even if we were both invented, I should have to write. Over and over again, the fellow who invented us, because it's his business to invent people, obliges me to take your Adam's apple in my hand and carry it to the spot that I saw it win or lose. And so to begin with, I make the mouse bob up and down above the screwdriver. I fling a multitude of replete seagulls into the fitful northeast wind high over Malke's head, call the weather summery and persistently fair, assume that the wreck was a former minesweeper of the Chaika class, and give the Baltic the color of thick glass seltzer bottles. Now that the scene of action's been identified as a point southeast of the Neufahrwasser harbored buoy, I make Malke's skin, from which water is still running in rivulets, take on a texture, somewhere between fine and coarse-grained. So in spite of the obfuscating style, we can reconstruct what happens in the book, and Wikipedia is good on this. The narrator describes the character, the great Malka, from their youth, together through to Malka's disappearance near the end of the Second World War. Much of the action of the story is on a half-submerged sunken minesweeper of the Polish Navy, on which the narrator Malka and their friends meet each summer. Malka explores the shipwreck by diving through a hatch, and with his ever-present screwdriver salvages various items, information plaques, objects left behind by the crew, and even a gramophone to sell or collect for himself. Over the course of the novella, Malka steals a Knight's Cross from a visiting U-boat captain and is expelled from school. He joins a panzer division and receives a Knight's Cross thanks to his successes in battle. Returning to the school from which he was expelled, however, the principal forbids him from making a speech to the students on the grounds of his former disgrace. The narrative in the story is often fairly incoherent. For instance, the timeline of the narration is often treated flexibly, moving from the narrator's perspective to different points within his memory of the events. There's also disunity about whether Malka is addressed in the second or third person, with Grass sometimes changing the form of address within a single sentence, possibly indicating the narrator's inability to remove his own emotions and feelings of guilt from an objective account of Malka. Malka, with the help of the narrator, returns to the shipwreck. Malka's main reason for entering the war in the first place was to make a speech at the school afterwards. Since he has denied that wish, Malka deserts his post, seeing no other reason to fight. Desertion implies treason and, in consequence, death. P-Lens, whose relationship to Malka becomes increasingly ambivalent, takes advantage of the situation and pressures an unwell Malka to dive into the wreck once more to hide, aware that Malka might not survive the dive. P-Lens never sees Malka again. When we look at Grass's style, when we look at the way events of the past are reconstructed, we see a general problem of historical narrative. First of all, what happened? What actually happened? How do I remember what happened? Am I self-censoring? If I was part of the events that I'm narrating, then maybe I've got a certain interest in censoring some aspects, some unpleasant aspects of the events that took place. And then, even if I'm self-censoring, how do I turn it into a narrative? How do I make a story out of it? And what am I prepared to admit? What am I not prepared to admit? This is the position of P-Lens, and we see it coming out in his narrative style. And clearly, these are questions that the writer Günter Grass asked of his own life. But there are also questions for West German society in the wake of World War II and in the wake of fascism. So we as readers are left with these questions. What actually happened? How can we reconstruct events from this rather reticent narrative? And why is the narrator so reticent? What is the narrator trying to hide? Did P-Lens betray the teacher Oswald Brunies, like we read on page 53? Oswald Brunies had a sweet tooth, and later, ostensibly because he had eaten some vitamin tablets that were supposed to be distributed among the students, but probably for political reasons, Brunies was a Freemason. He was arrested at school. Some of the students were questioned. I hope I didn't testify against him. His adoptive daughter, a doll-like creature who took ballet lessons, wore mourning in public. They took him to Stutthof, where he stayed. Did he betray Malka, like we read at the very end of the book? And we're left trying to interpret this central image of the cat and the mouse, the Adam's apple, and the event, and again P-Lens. It turns out he was actually the person who set the cat on the Adam's apple, although he takes an awful long time admitting it in the book. And why did he do it? And why is he so hesitant to tell us the truth? And Grass ends the book with an image of how the traumatic past refuses to go away in contemporary West Germany. Who will supply me with a good ending? For what began with cat and mouse torments me today in the form of crested terns on ponds bordered with rushes. Though I avoid nature, educational films show me these clever aquatic birds, or the newsreels make me watch attempts to raise sunken freight barges in the Rhine or underwater operations in Hamburg harbor. It seems they're blasting the fortifications near the Hold shipyard and salvaging aerial mines. Men go down with flashing, slightly battered helmets. Men rise to the surface. Arms are held out toward them. The helmet is unscrewed, removed, but never does the great Malka light a cigarette on the flickering screen. It's always somebody else who lights up. Why does Grass write the way he writes? Well, once he said, books are delayed action explosives. They're released by the author and they explode in the reader's head. And this, it seems, is what we are supposed to experience in the reading of a book like Cat and Mouse. We're given some certain puzzles which we can witness exploding in our head, and it's up to us what we do with that. Grass was a very prolific writer. He published over 30 volumes of fiction and poetry, and he was an extremely successful writer. In 1999, the Nobel Prize Committee gave the prize to Günter Grass, whose frolicsome black fables portray the forgotten face of history. And Grass died in the year 2015.